He was dying. At least, that's what he told them. The doctors delivered the news in hushed, somber tones. Terminal cancer. 6 months, maybe less. His wife cried. His children stood in shock. But what none of them knew was that the old man lying in that bed wasn't sick at all. He was testing them. Testing to see who would stay when the money stopped flowing, when the power faded, when all that was left was a frail, dying man who needed help getting out of bed. And what he discovered in the months that followed would break his heart and change his will forever. Because only one person stayed. Only one person cared. And by the end, that person would inherit everything. This is the story of a billionaire who faked his own death to find out who truly loved him. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. His name was Henry Carter, and he had spent 50 years building an empire. Henry came from nothing. He grew up in a small town in West Virginia, the son of a coal miner who died of black lung when Henry was 14. Henry dropped out of high school to work, taking jobs in factories, warehouses, anywhere that would pay him. He was smart, driven, and willing to work longer and harder than anyone else. By the time he was 25, he had saved enough money to start a small construction company. He worked 18-hour days, personally overseeing every job, learning the business from the ground up. The company grew slowly at first, then faster as Henry's reputation for reliability and quality spread. By his 40s, Henry was a millionaire. By his 60s, he was a billionaire. He owned real estate across 3 states, had investments in dozens of companies, and lived in a mansion that looked like something out of a movie. But wealth, Henry learned, came with complications. He had married young, to a woman named Catherine who had been his high school sweetheart. They had 4 children together, 3 sons and a daughter. Henry loved his family, but as his business grew, he spent less and less time with them. He missed birthdays, school plays, family dinners. He told himself he was doing it for them, building a future they could be proud of. But the truth was, Henry didn't know how to be anything other than a businessman. By the time he was in his 70s, Henry's relationship with his family had become transactional. His children called when they needed money. His wife organized charity events and spent his fortune on things he didn't care about. They lived in the same house, but they felt like strangers. Henry started to wonder if anyone in his life actually loved him, or if they just loved what he could provide. That question haunted him, kept him awake at night, made him feel more alone than he had ever felt, even when he was young and poor. Then, one evening, Henry had an idea. It was extreme, maybe even cruel, but he needed to know the truth. He called his personal physician, a man named Dr. Alan Morris who had been treating him for years. Henry told Dr. Morris his plan, and at first, the doctor refused. "It's unethical, Henry. I can't lie to your family about something like this." But Henry was persistent. He explained that he wasn't asking Dr. Morris to harm anyone, just to deliver a message. Henry would handle the rest. Eventually, Dr. Morris agreed, though he made it clear he didn't approve. Henry also brought his lawyer, a sharp, discreet man named Walter Green, into the plan. Walter's job was to quietly move half of Henry's assets into a trust that only Henry and Walter knew about. The rest would stay visible, accessible to his family. Henry wanted to see what they would do when they thought his fortune was about to become theirs. The stage was set. 1 week later, Dr. Morris came to the Carter estate. He asked to speak with the entire family. Catherine, Henry's wife, gathered their children. There was Richard, the oldest, 48, ambitious and always impatient. There was Daniel, 45, quieter but equally focused on money. There was Stephen, 42, charming but irresponsible. And there was Emma, the youngest, 38, who had always been different from her brothers, softer, more thoughtful, less interested in the family business. They all gathered in the living room, confused about why the doctor had called this meeting. Dr. Morris looked somber as he explained. Your father has been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. It's advanced, and I'm afraid there's nothing we can do. He has 6 months, maybe less. The room fell silent. Catherine's hand flew to her mouth, tears immediately filling her eyes. Richard stood frozen, his face pale. Daniel stared at the floor. Stephen looked like he might be sick. Emma began to cry, quietly, her hands shaking. Dr. Morris continued, explaining that Henry would need full-time care, that his condition would deteriorate quickly, that they should prepare themselves. After the doctor left, the family sat in stunned silence. Catherine was the first to speak, her voice breaking. I can't believe this. I can't lose him. Richard put a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady but strained. We'll get through this. We'll take care of him. The others nodded, murmuring agreements. Henry, who had been listening from his bedroom upstairs, felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he had been wrong. Maybe they did care. The first few days after the diagnosis, the house was full of activity. Catherine organized Henry's care, hiring nurses, setting up a schedule for medication, making sure he was comfortable. Richard took charge of the business, stepping into his father's role with surprising ease. Daniel and Stephen visited frequently, asking how Henry was feeling, if he needed anything. Emma barely left his side. She sat with him for hours, reading to him, talking to him, holding his hand. Henry felt guilty for lying, but he told himself he needed to see how long it would last. And sure enough, after about 2 weeks, things started to change. Catherine, who had been attentive at first, began spending more time away from the house. She claimed she needed to keep up with her charity commitments, that people were counting on her. Henry understood, but he noticed that she didn't come to his room as often. When she did, she seemed distracted, uncomfortable. She would ask how he was feeling, but she wouldn't stay long. It was like she couldn't bear to look at him. Richard, meanwhile, became completely absorbed in running the business. He moved into Henry's office, started making decisions without consulting anyone, began talking about the future of the company as if Henry were already gone. Henry heard through Walter that Richard had started spending extravagantly, buying expensive cars, booking luxury trips, acting like the money was already his. Daniel was more subtle, but he started asking questions about the will, about how assets would be divided, about what would happen to certain properties. He framed it as concern, as wanting to make sure everything was in order, but Henry could hear the greed underneath. Stephen stopped visiting altogether after the first month. He sent texts, brief messages asking how Henry was doing, but he never showed up. Henry learned from Emma that Stephen had gone to Europe, that he was traveling, living it up, apparently not too concerned about his dying father. The only person who stayed constant was Emma. She came every day, often staying overnight in the guest room next to Henry's bedroom. She helped him eat when he pretended to be too weak to feed himself. She changed his sheets, kept his room clean, read him books, played his favorite music. She never asked about money. She never talked about the will. She just stayed. One evening, about 3 months into the charade, Emma was sitting beside Henry's bed, reading aloud from a novel. Henry interrupted her, his voice weak. Emma, why are you still here? Emma looked up, surprised by the question. What do you mean? Henry gestured vaguely. Your brothers are off living their lives. Your mother can barely stand to be in the same room as me. But you're here every day. Why? Emma set the book down, her expression soft. Because you're my dad. And you need someone. Henry felt tears prick his eyes. He had to look away. But what about your life? Don't you have things you'd rather be doing? Emma shook her head. There's nothing more important than this. You've been there for me my whole life. Now it's my turn to be here for you. Henry couldn't speak. He just reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep in the chair beside his bed, Henry made a decision. He had seen enough. He knew the truth. The next morning, Henry called Walter and Dr. Morris. He told them it was time to end the test. He wanted to gather his family and reveal everything. 1 week later, on a Saturday afternoon, Henry asked Catherine to gather everyone in the living room. He said he had something important to discuss. Catherine looked worried, probably assuming he wanted to talk about funeral arrangements or final wishes. She called Richard, Daniel, and Stephen, telling them to come to the house immediately. Emma was already there, as she had been every day. When everyone was assembled, sitting on the couches and chairs, looking somber and expectant, Henry walked into the room. He wasn't in a wheelchair. He wasn't using a walker. He just walked in, slowly but steadily, looking healthier than he had in months. The room went silent. Catherine's mouth fell open. Richard stood up, his face confused. Daniel and Stephen looked at each other, bewildered. Emma just stared, tears filling her eyes. Henry stood in the center of the room, looking at each of them. "I'm not dying." Catherine's voice came out as a whisper. "What?" Henry repeated himself, louder this time. "I'm not dying. There is no cancer. I lied." Richard's face turned red. "You what?" Henry held up a hand. "Let me explain. I did this because I needed to know the truth. I needed to know who in this family actually loved me, and who just loved my money." The room erupted. Catherine started crying, saying she couldn't believe he would do something so cruel. Richard was furious, shouting that Henry had manipulated them, that this was sick. Daniel looked like he didn't know whether to be angry or relieved. Stephen just sat there, stunned. Emma said nothing. She just kept staring at her father, tears streaming down her face. Henry waited for the noise to die down, then continued. "I've spent the last 3 months watching all of you. Watching how you acted when you thought I was dying. And I learned a lot. Catherine, you couldn't even be in the same room as me. You were too uncomfortable, too afraid. Richard, you started spending my money before I was even gone, acting like you were already in charge. Daniel, you kept asking about the will, about what you would get. Stephen, you didn't even bother to come back from your vacation." He turned to Emma, his voice softening. "But you, Emma. You stayed. You took care of me. You didn't ask for anything. You just loved me." Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "I would have stayed even if you were really dying, Dad. I would have stayed no matter what." Henry nodded, his own tears falling now. "I know. And that's why I'm giving everything to you." The room exploded again. Richard started shouting, saying this wasn't fair, that he had worked for the company, that he deserved something. Catherine was sobbing, saying Henry had lost his mind. Daniel tried to reason with him, saying they could work something out, that this didn't have to be so extreme. Stephen finally found his voice, begging Henry to reconsider. But Henry was firm. Walter Green, who had been standing quietly in the corner, stepped forward and handed out copies of the new will. Everything, the house, the business, the investments, all of it, was going to Emma. Richard, Daniel, Stephen, and Catherine would each receive a modest sum, enough to live comfortably but nothing compared to the full estate. Henry looked at his family, his voice steady. "You all showed me who you are when you thought I had nothing left to give. Emma showed me who she is when she thought I had everything to lose. That's the difference. And that's why she's the only one who deserves this." Richard stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Catherine left shortly after, still crying. Daniel and Stephen lingered, trying one last time to change Henry's mind, but eventually they gave up and left too. Only Emma stayed, sitting beside her father, holding his hand. Henry lived for another 8 years after that day. Emma took over the management of his fortune, running it with the same care and integrity her father had. She never flaunted the money, never used it to lord over her brothers or her mother. She just lived her life quietly, taking care of her father in his final years, making sure he was comfortable, happy, loved. When Henry finally did pass away, at the age of 82, Emma was there, holding his hand, just as she had been all those years ago when he had pretended to be dying. The rest of the family showed up for the funeral, of course. They paid their respects, said their goodbyes. But the relationship was never the same. Richard, Daniel, Stephen, and Catherine had shown their true colors, and they would have to live with that for the rest of their lives. Emma, meanwhile, used her inheritance to build something meaningful. She started a foundation in her father's name, funding scholarships for kids from low-income families, supporting small businesses, helping people who reminded her of the young man her father had once been, struggling but determined to build something better. And whenever people asked her how she had ended up with such a fortune, she would smile and say, "I just stayed when everyone else left. That's all." So here's what I want to ask you. If you were Henry, would you have done the same thing? Do you think testing your family like that was fair, or was it cruel? And if you were one of his children, how would you have reacted when you found out the truth? Let me know in the comments. I really want to hear your thoughts. And if this story made you think about what really matters, about who stays when things get hard, hit that subscribe button. We're going to keep sharing stories that make you reflect on love, loyalty, and what it means to truly care about someone. Next time, I'm going to tell you about a woman who discovered her husband had been living a double life for 20 years, and how one forgotten phone call exposed everything. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and remember, the people who love you will stay even when there's nothing left to gain.